Welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the forthcoming Japan 3DS mandate that comes into force at the end of March. I have here with me Galit Shani Michelle, who's our VP of Payments at Forter, and I'm going to hand over to Galit now.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to speak about this important topic of the new coming regulation about 5 weeks to go now. So as Kirsty said, please feel free to drop your question in the chat. We will answer them during the session or at the end. And we are always also happy to meet with you after to elaborate more. So we want to talk about the part of being compliant, who is affected by this new regulation, what's the requirement, what does it really mean for you? And then on top of that, how do you really optimize? How do you make sure that the customer experience will be as less impacted as possible? And how can you actually be qualified for exemptions? So we'll start with a small poll. How prepared is your organization to comply with Japan new 3DS mandate? So one, you don't have any in-scope transaction. Two, you're not ready yet, but you will be ready by enforcement date. Three, you already deployed the solution. And four, we are not sure of the implication of the regulation yet, which is why we are here today. So it's perfectly fine. Okay, so thank you everyone. So we can see here that it kind of split between, we see most of the participants are not ready yet, but feel that they will be ready by the enforcement date. We have also some that already deployed a solution, and then some that are not sure or don't have any in-scope transactions. Good. So let's dive into it, and hopefully you will have a better understanding after this half an hour. So starting with compliance to understand the regulation, it's called Credit Card Security Guidelines 5.0. All e-commerce credit card transaction processed in Japan must implement 3DS authentication by the end of March. This means that processed in Japan means that you're actually using a Japanese acquirer for your transactions. Even if you are using an international PSP like Adyen, Stripe, Checkout, WorldPay, they all have local acquiring in Japan. So of course you need to consult with them, but most merchants processing with them, Japan traffic is routed to the Japanese acquirer, which means that you are obligated to comply with the regulation. And of course, if you work directly with one of the Japanese acquirers, then you're obligated. Even if these transactions are not Japanese transactions, so from some reason, someone with a credit card from US is being processed on the Japanese MID, then it's also part of the regulation. The goal of the JCA is to reduce the fraud in credit card transaction, and it applies to domestic and cross-border transaction and all credit card types. And it's valid regardless of any other payment security measure that you already have in place. What is excluded from the regulation? So this is important. We will talk about exemptions from 3DS in a second, but what is like totally out of the regulation? Prepaid and debit cards, devices that do not support 3DS, like game consoles, mail order, telephone order, MIT. So if it's a merchant-initiated transaction, obviously you cannot do 3DS there. Internal or B2B transaction in dedicated environment. So you have your employees paying on your websites with your corporate cards, and Google Pay and Apple Pay. But this basically means that most of your online transactions are part of this online credit card transaction being done by a customer is part of this regulation. Very important to understand, there are three scenarios that you need to actually choose which one you want to use to be compliant. And you need to agree with your processor which scenario you are going to be in. So it's very important to understand the scenario so you will know what to ask for. Scenario number one, merchant determined authentication. The acquirer needs to approve it, and you need to meet a checklist. So you go to your acquirer, you ask for a checklist to be compliant with scenario one. Scenario one is the best one that you can get. Because it means if you get the approval that you don't have to do 3DS on all your transactions. You only have to do it if the event is suspicious. So on a suspicious login, on a suspicious registration, on a suspicious transaction, you will need to do 3DS. Your good customers will have a good customer experience. You will not need to do 3DS for them. And this is why it's the best scenario. Again, the way to get it is to go to your PSP to say we want to apply to scenario one, get the checklist, and fill it out and try to apply for it. Scenario two, not as good as scenario one, but also pretty good and better than 100% 3DS. This means that you authenticate new cards. So if someone added a card, you will authenticate with 3DS. But once the card is stored after 3DS, the consumer can pay with that card without 3DS. So this is giving really good customer experience to your returning users. And it's also a pretty good option. You have to meet the security checklist for account protection. I will talk about it in a second. And as I said, 3DS only when the card is new. Scenario three, and this is the default. So I always like to say what happens if you do nothing. So if you do nothing, you get scenario three. Scenario three means that each transaction on your website in Japan will have a 3DS. Not a great customer experience, and not great versus the competition, your competition, that some of them are already approved for scenario one. So you are giving this 3DS window on every transaction, while somewhere else customer can buy frictionless, with a frictionless experience. But this will be your default if you don't talk to your PSP and if you don't get approval for one or for two. Okay. If you have any question, drop it in the chat and Kirsty will stop me because I probably will miss it. So which scenario are you preparing for, if any at all? Scenario 1, 2, or 3, or it's not applicable for you at the moment, or you're not sure? Okay, so this is really amazing. We are seeing that 45% are actually planning for scenario 1. So this is great. And we'll talk about what you need to do in case you did not get approval for it yet. I'll talk about it in a second. We see 9% scenario 2, 18% scenario 3. So they're going to have 3DS on all the transaction. And there is 27% that are still not sure. And we are happy to try to help you out here. Good. So thank you everyone for participating. And we keep going. So what does it mean, security checklist that I talked about before for both scenario 1 and 2? And it refers to account protection. A lot of time payment people, I don't know what's your role in the organization, but we always think about transaction, about 3DS, about a lot of things related to the transaction. This Japanese regulation kind of forces us to look at the bigger picture And basically what it says is if someone saved the card and 3DS happened, or maybe didn't happen, and then they want to use it again, the regulator wants to see that you have measures in place against account takeover. You want to make sure nobody else will log into my account, use the card that I saved. And if they are sure it's always Kirsty logging into Kirsty account, then okay, we don't need to ask for 3DS again and again and again from Kirsty. So what is this account protection security list? So it's referring to logging into the account and not to the transaction. Implement access restriction for suspicious IP address. Implement login attempts limits to counter account password cracking. A lot of bot activities today. It's pretty easy with the technology today to log into someone else's account if you can just try a lot of times because you have some bot that is trying for you. Use two-factor authentication or other identity verification methods to authenticate and alert users in case of fraudulent login attempt. So if it looks like someone logged into my account, they expect you to notify me as the consumer to ask me, was that you trying to log into your account because something looks suspicious? Enable email or SMS notification, throttling, and bot countermeasure at login. So again, bot is a very big problem these days. And if it looks like a bot is trying to enter an account, they expect that you send an SMS and you notify the consumer about his account. And the last one is utilize additional account protection methods, such as device fingerprinting. Basically, all of this means you can't have a fraud tool on the transaction only anymore. You have to have a bigger protection. It can be from your fraud vendor if they provide it. So for example, at Forter, we provide also protection on the account and not just on the transaction. But if you have something, you can also have a different solution for account and for the transaction, but you need to have a solution to make sure your accounts are protected. If you don't have that, now your consumers are suffering from 3DS on every transaction. Of course, at Forter, our account protection solution supports all of these requirements, and we will be happy to elaborate more with you. In terms of the fraud management checklist, this is related to the checkout, so to the fraud on the transaction. Again, they expect fraud management active 24/7 in real time, dynamic authentication capabilities, including MFA, 2FA, SMS, biometric authentication, basically anything which says we know how to authenticate someone if we need to. Low value transaction velocity checks and limits, again, to make sure all the activity is good activity. Use of delivery address information and other customer data attributes to check and match the regulatory and combination of data. Ability to withdraw delivery, basically to stop or hold the delivery if there is a fraud concern. And utilize device fingerprinting as part of the risk assessment. So basically, once again, and we saw it from merchants that applied to scenario one, Forter merchants that we helped them to apply to scenario one, they want to know that you have a very good fraud management solution in place and an advanced one. So if you just have some kind of rules that's stopping very specific things, that will probably not pass what they are asking for. And this is why they are asking for all of this. And look at the end, they are saying device fingerprint as part of the risk assessment. And of course, our fraud management will support all of this requirement. So now that we understand actually the regulation, we want to talk about the optimization piece. So how can you really make sure that this new regulation is not harming your customer experience? And with our experience from PSD2 in Europe, we know that merchants that did not do all the things they could do, their performance actually dropped a lot. With scenario 3, legislation will introduce friction for all the transaction at checkout, and the cost for this for you is 10 to 20%. negative impact to revenue. And this is really important to understand. With scenario 2, you will have to do authentication friction. It can be avoided at login and checkout for good customers. And you will still need to do 3DS when they register a card. So much better than scenario 3. But still, when they want to register a card, 3DS will be applied. And then with scenario 1, authentication friction can be avoided at all touch points for the good customers, sign up, login, card registration, and checkout. Unless it's a suspicious activity, you can basically avoid the challenge, which is super, super, super important. So what do we really want to do here? We want to minimize the friction and maximize the conversion. You don't want your customers to have a worse experience just because a regulation came into place. The PSD2 regulation started 4 years ago. And even now, when merchants are over-applying 3DS, we still see that they are losing a lot of their transactions and conversion. So it's not about consumers will get used to it, it's okay. It's not really okay. Consumers are really looking for a frictionless experience. They are not happy when you ask them for a lot of authentication during the process. So what's important to get this frictionless experience? Secure accounts, compliant protection to minimize fake account creation and prevent account takeover. As we talked before, you have to secure your account to avoid a 3DS later. Fraud prevention, compliant fraud solution at the point of the checkout for both the guest and the account checkout. Super, super important. And here is a point we didn't discuss yet. Issuer preference model for 3DS. This is super important. The regulation will come into effect in 5 weeks. Issuers will also behave in a way and react to this regulation. They may be more sensitive to non-3DS transactions. Their auth rate might be lower for non-3DS transactions. So it's really, really important to look at the issuer and say, okay, what is this issuer expecting to see? Is the issuer expecting to see a 3DS, or they will approve the transaction without 3DS? Because if you try to avoid 3DS and the issuer actually looking for 3DS, the transaction will fail. In Europe, for example, we saw banks in Sweden, in Denmark, their auth rate was like 0 or 30, 40% without 3DS. So it's really important to have an issuer preference model in place that will be able to know in real time and updated all the time from the ecosystem, should we apply 3DS just because the auth rate is going to be very low without it. And then the last point, secure payment card data. You want to use an agnostic tokenization solution. You want to store your cards in a good voting solution where you use account updater and you maintain updated cards. So if the card is expired and you use account updater to update it, now you don't need to ask the consumer to do 3DS when they update the card. So here is another friction that you can save for your good customers. I don't know, maybe Kirsty, we stop here and we see if we have any questions, because I feel like I'm speaking a lot.
Haven't seen any questions so far. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat or to go to the Q&A box and submit your question there. Maybe you're just explaining everything so clearly, Galit, that is very well understood.
Okay, so I'll keep going, but please feel free to drop your question.
Or
You have
maybe
questions?
attendees are too shy, and if you're too shy,
Yeah.
that's fine as well. There'll be an option at the end where you can schedule a follow-up session with Galit, and perhaps you'd like to ask your questions privately, so you're welcome to do that as well.
Okay, so now that you understand the regulation, I want to tell you how Forter solves this, and we are really using everything we learned from PSD2 and even from what we are doing in some other markets that are not regulated but prefer 3DS from different reasons, like India. So this is our solution for Japan. The solution for Japan aim to maximize the conversion under the new mandate. Basically, as much as possible, we don't want your consumers to even feel anything different. March comes, end of March comes. Account protection plus fraud management plus the payment optimization piece. So account protection, prevent the fraudulent account and unauthorized access while reducing the MFA. So basically, we don't want to ask your customers every time they log in to have to authenticate themselves, but we also want to make sure nobody can log into their accounts. Fraud management, we block the fraud. Obviously, we keep the legitimate customers with our machine learning that powers our decision engine. And this has been around for many years, and we already know that the regulator in Japan is satisfied with the fraud management of Forter because we have customers that got approval for scenario 1 based on the fact that they are using the Forter system. And the last piece, which is unique to Forter, is intelligently apply 3DS to reduce friction and risk. So as I said, we know when to apply 3DS intelligently to make sure that your consumers will not be declined because the bank is not happy. And the other thing we can help you with is with the tokenization and how to keep your vote in an agnostic place up to date using account updater and network token.
We have
So this is the fourth. Yeah.
A question about the issuer preference model for 3DS. The question is, surely we can only know this over time, right? Or is it a proactive approach being done now that to know what Japanese issuers' preference will be?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. We don't know what it will be after the regulation. We can see what it is now, and actually, right now, we don't see issuers that very much prefer 3DS. Sometimes the auth rate is a bit better, but we don't see anything significant yet. But once the regulation starts, our model will pick it up immediately. So even if on a specific day an issuer has changed their behavior, the model will pick it up immediately and will start to apply more 3DS on the transactions. Okay, thank you for the person that was not shy to ask a question. How do we view it? Smart friction, seamless experience. What does that mean? We target security checks only where needed. So we look at the whole flow. And as I said, if some of you are payment people, like I am, and I was a manager many years, we used to look at the checkout only, but the picture is bigger. So we look at the full picture with Forter. There is sign up, login, registration of card, and checkout. We can apply a friction at any of these stages, or we can decide not to apply a friction. So if the customer is really good and we understand identities and consumers, so when someone tries to log in on your site, Porter probably knows him, and we know that he's a good person or not. If he's a good person, we don't ask for friction on sign up or on login or on registration on checkout, and he just gets green all the way. Do you know this feeling? You drive the car. We used to have traffic lights here, but it was a bit messy, so we took it off. You know this feeling? You drive the car in the city and you get like 4 lights, all of them are green, and you feel like really good about yourself. That's how they feel, right? We just don't bother them at all, and they are so happy. And all you need to do then is to make sure that you are giving them what they want in terms of your business and what they are buying. Suspicious customer, we have different options. We can ask them to verify themselves at sign up, so we are sure they are who they say they are. We can let them sign up, but then verify them at login. We can let them sign up and log in to make them happy and verify them at card registration or at checkout. This is really depend on the scenario and on your preference. Some customers say, I don't want any suspicious people even opening an account. And some say, I don't care if they open an account, but I just don't want them to pay. So suspicious customers can be stopped at the right time by Forter, and bad actors will be stopped immediately when we realize they are bad. If they are bad at sign up, we will already not let them in. So you can think about this security guy at the entrance of the shop. He just will not let them in even to start walking around. You don't want this. You don't want these people walking around in your store. I think we have a question on the chat, or no?
Yep,
Yes.
another question for you. Is there anything that we should pay attention to when it comes to the liability shift process in 3DS if we're in scenario 3?
So in scenario 3, there will be liability shift on all the transactions because 3DS will be applied to all the transactions. Liability shift is great. The challenge becomes how much conversion are you losing because of this experience. From our experience, that can be even up to 10%. So that's the liability. I will maybe answer the question I was not asked about what happened if you're in scenario 1 and you do only 3DS on the suspicious transactions, then you don't have the liability. I mean, my answer would be if you have a good fraud management system, you don't have to worry about the chargebacks because that's, let's say with Forter, that's our responsibility. We let the people in because we believe they are good. We will commit on the chargeback rate for you. And the idea is that your chargeback rate will be really low, so you don't have to worry about it.
There's a follow-up question here, Gilly, and I think it sort of adds a bit more context to the question. So it says in scenario 1, 2, or 3, will there be some monitoring program from the card schemes like VDMP, VFMP, and obviously we've got the upcoming VAMP. They like their acronyms. Like, will they be different in different scenarios?
So at the moment, the answer is no, because the programs, it's actually a really good question. I never thought about it. The programs comes from the schemes. So it's like VAMP, all of these ones. It's a Visa program. And this regulation is not coming from the schemes. So it's the same programs. It's true that even if there are 3DS transactions, that then there are chargebacks. It's part of the programs. So it will be counted to you toward the program. And this is the reason that you don't want to send fraudulent transaction to 3DS. Sending all of your fraud to 3DS, later on, there will be chargebacks and you will get into the programs. So the most important thing to note about the program is stop the fraud immediately, always, and then borderline send it to 3DS. But if you are not sure about them and the good transaction, try to avoid 3DS. Also about maybe one sentence about the new Visa one that is coming in April. It monitors enumeration, car testing. So you need to make sure that you are stopping the car testing, and pre-auth fraud solution will do that for you. I think I'll move on because we are close to the hour. So important also, the Forter system will learn to minimize the friction for the future customer interaction. If we were not sure about the customer, at the checkout, we did an authentication, a 3DS, because we were not sure. He passed the authentication. He comes back in a week to buy again from you. He will have the green all the way. We are not going to ask him for an authentication again because right now we know him and we are very happy with him. So we are to our last poll now. Would you like us to follow up with you to discuss the regulation in details?
I can see the answers coming in there, and we'll follow up with you after this call. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I especially want to thank Gilly, our VP of Payments, for all the details and insights that she's provided on this regulation. And as we prepare for enforcement, we're here to help and support you on this journey. So look forward to speaking to you all in more detail in the future. Thanks for all the positive comments in the chat as well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.